Welcome to episode 1 of hashtag Ask Abhijit. First of all, thank you very much for all your questions. I have received way more questions than I could possibly contemplate squeezing into one episode of hashtag Ask Abhijit. So it's already clear to me that I will have to create at least one follow-up episode. Now, about the format of this episode, I am going to take up, I think, 5 or 6 questions today. Now, I could take up 10 or 15 questions and try to squeeze them in about half an hour or so, but that would not provide you with any real value. So that's why I have decided to go with 5 questions today. Right, so let's dive right in. Ravi asks, do you think our history needs to be rewritten? Great question. Should India's history textbooks be rewritten? And my answer to that is 100% yes, they should. So let me explain why I say this. So if you look at India's education system, it is a relic of the British Raj. It is more or less the same system that the British instituted more than a century ago. It's a relic of the 19th century education system that the British instituted in India. And after India got its independence in 1947, India's new rulers continued the same education system. And what's worse is that they outsourced the writing of India's history textbooks to Marxist historians. And what we see in India's history textbooks today is a consequence of all that. So if we look at the textbooks, we find that there are a number of recurring deficiencies, whether the textbook is at the school level, the college level, or even at the PhD level. We find that the overall chronology of India's history remains more or less the same as it should. However, the problems lie in the details. So what we see is that there are numerous gaps, there are omissions, there are distortions in the way India's history is written and depicted. There is a consistent colonial and Hindu-phobic narrative that is woven throughout the accounts of India's history. And there is a consistent glorification of foreign invaders, occupiers, and colonialists. And what we see is that there is also a blanket whitewashing of the genocides and the crimes against humanity that these foreign powers perpetrated in India. So let's take a look at a few examples. Now, you must have heard of the Aryan Invasion theory. India's history textbooks treat the Aryan Invasion theory as a de facto self-evident gospel truth. So the fact is that the Aryan Invasion theory is a colonial narrative. It was created during the colonial era in the 19th century, and later on, after independence, it was championed by the Marxists and it acquired Marxist qualities. And there is an immense amount of scientific and empirical evidence that completely demolishes every aspect of this theory. I myself have written several articles about that debunk this theory, and there are many scholars who have written books and articles and research papers, and if you look at all of this evidence together as a whole, it totally annihilates the Aryan Invasion theory. And despite this, India's history textbooks continue to portray the Aryan Invasion theory as the self-evident gospel truth. So that's a huge problem that we find in India's history textbooks. The other thing is that India's local histories have been completely erased from Indian history textbooks. Think about Assam, for example. Do you know anything about the history of Assam? I bet you don't. Assam has a rich and interesting and fascinating history, and it's never spoken about It's never mentioned in India's history textbooks. Think about the Maratha Empire. The Marathas were the power that destroyed, annihilated the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire was ended by the Marathas, and the Maratha Empire stretched from the south of India all the way to the borders of Tibet, and it included parts of Afghanistan. Now, how many of you know this? India's history textbooks do not mention this. The Marathas reconquered India and established Hindavi Swaraj in India. But this is a fact that is completely glossed over in India's history textbooks. What about Rajputana? What about Gujarat? What do we learn about these places in India's history textbooks? We learn next to nothing. If you think about Gujarat, it's got an incredibly ancient history. It was the seat of, it was not entirely, but it was partially the seat of the Harappan civilization. So it's got a very ancient history, and even its recent history is very interesting. It's got its own distinctive culture, but you will not see this mentioned anywhere in India's history textbooks. Think about Manipur, for example. Can you even place Manipur on the map of India? Most people can't. Most people haven't even heard of Manipur. Manipur has a fascinating and vibrant culture. It's the last bastion of Hinduism in India, and its history goes back, its recorded written history goes back more than 2,000 years. It has a lineage of kings that goes back more than 2,000 years, and yet you will never see a word about Manipur in India's history textbooks. Think about Kalinga, Magad. What about Gandhara? Most people cannot place these locations on India's map. Of course, Gandhara is now not within the political boundaries of India as of today, but it was historically very much part of India. And these places have very interesting, fascinating, and rich histories that we never get to hear about, that we never get to learn about. And it's a shame, isn't it? Because India as a civilization is made up of all these different individual local histories and cultures. And this is something that we should learn about. But that's not what happens. It's totally blanked out from India's history textbooks. The Indian history textbooks are pretty much single track and one dimensional. What about how India influenced other countries in its neighborhood and beyond? How did India influence Eastern Asia, Southeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea? Do we know about this? What about how India influenced Central Asia or Europe? So let's talk about Southeast Asia, for example. Has anybody heard of the Chola dynasty? The Chola dynasty happens to be the longest ruling dynasty in the history of the world. The Chola dynasty was established around 300 BCE, and it ruled over large parts of South India and far beyond that until approximately in the 13th century. So that gives it a span of about 1,500 years, which is incredible. And we never get to hear about this in India's history textbooks. Now, the Cholas, they conquered vast parts of Southeast Asia. They conquered Sri Lanka, they conquered the Maldives, they conquered parts of Myanmar, of Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Laos, Vietnam, and their influence spread all the way to the Philippines. And what the Cholas did was that they they patronized and propagated Sanskrit and Hinduism throughout Southeast Asia. What you find today is that the grandest and most magnificent examples of Hindu temple architecture are found not in India, but in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, and elsewhere. It's because of the Chola influence. And this completely demolishes the lie that Tamil culture is distinct and separate from Indian or Hindu culture, because the Cholas were a Tamil dynasty. So India had an immense amount of influence over Southeast Asia. What about China? The Chinese scholar Hu Shi said that India was able to conquer China culturally without ever sending a single soldier across the Himalayas. And this was done not by soldiers but by scholars. India sent scholars to these places. You must have heard of the Shaolin Temple, the birthplace of Kung Fu. Well, do you know that the Shaolin Temple was constructed for Indian scholars? It was created to house Indian scholars who would translate Sanskrit sutras into Chinese. And one of these scholars was an Indian monk whose name was Bodhidharma. And he is the one who introduced a martial art to China, which is now known as Kung Fu. So Bodhidharma is the first patriarch of the Shaolin Temple. There's a giant statue of Bodhidharma on top of a hill that overlooks the temple. And Bodhidharma is the father of Kung Fu. He is the one who introduced this Indian martial art into China. And of course, I'm not saying it's an Indian martial art. The Chinese developed it, expanded it, and they made it what it is today. But its origins lie in India. And Bodhidharma was not just a Kung Fu master, he was a Dhyana master. He introduced the practice of Dhyana meditation into China. And the Chinese call it Chan instead of Dhyana because they pronounce things differently. And Chinese monks carried this practice into Japan, where it was renamed as Zen. So Zen Buddhism is nothing but Dhyana meditation. And that's how far India's influence spread. Now, if you look at Japan, its entire culture is based upon a bedrock of Indian culture. Buddhism is very much part of Japanese culture. It is now part of a syncretic culture with Shintoism. And there are lots of Hindu practices in Japan. Many Hindu gods and goddesses such as Ganesha and Saraswati and many others are worshipped in Japan under Hindu names. And you still see Sanskrit sutras being chanted in Japan. You will see inscriptions in the Sharda script in Japan. So the Japanese culture is entirely based upon a bedrock of Indian culture. So Japan is a dharmic nation. And it is the world's most advanced nation. So that's what dharmic culture can do. So you don't get to learn any of this in India's history textbooks, how India's influence spread so far and wide. It also spread to Korea. And what about Central Asia? The whole of Central Asia was immersed in Indian culture before the Turkic and the Mongol invasions. The Gandhari language was once the lingua franca of Central Asia. And if you look westward to Europe, there's also a huge amount of evidence that Indian culture spread far and wide. Not just Indian culture, but Indian people and Indian genetics spread far and wide all the way to the westernmost reaches of Europe. And you will not see India's history textbooks mention even a word about any of these things. And isn't that a crying shame? Now, what about how Islam entered India? Well, clearly, the people who brought Islam into India did not come as legal immigrants. They did not apply for visas. They barged in, they invaded, they plundered, they destroyed. And this is not mentioned in India's history textbooks. It is whitewashed out. The Islamic genocides, the Islamic genocide of India is entirely whitewashed. Not a word of it will be found in any Indian history textbook, not even obliquely. If you look at the statistics of the Islamic genocide of India, you can find the statistics which are meticulously recorded in the accounts of various Muslim chroniclers who accompanied the Islamic invaders into India. And if you tally it up, you can see that the numbers are staggering. One can easily estimate a figure of, at the very least, 100 million deaths over a number of centuries, over about 5 centuries in India. And that's a very conservative figure. Akbar, for example, Do your textbooks tell you that Akbar had 30,000 surrendered Rajput warriors beheaded in just one single day in Chittorgarh? No, they won't. Even the New York Times agrees that Aurangzeb was responsible for genocide. According to New York Times statistics, he was responsible for the deaths of at least 4 million Indians, who obviously were Hindus. And these are extraordinarily conservative figures. The real figures are very much higher. And none of these things are alluded to in India's history textbooks. Our texts will not tell us about how Christianity entered India. They will not tell us about the horrors and the barbarity of the Goa Inquisition, which the Portuguese carried out with the help of Francis Xavier. They will not tell us about how lots of people in India became Christian, how this religion entered Indian society. This will never be mentioned anywhere. The word Inquisition won't be found anywhere. And India's history textbooks will not tell you anything about the genocide that the British perpetrated in India. In the aftermath of the 1857 War of Independence, in just a few years, the British killed at least 10 million Indians in revenge for the uprising. The British created artificial famines in India year after year after year, and they killed at least 100 million Indians by doing so, by creating artificial famines. And these famines resulted in epidemics as well, and that's what caused so many deaths. But these were all indirect deaths. They were not deaths by gunshots or by the sword. And yet there was a genocide, just like the Irish famine that the British created in the 19th century. And if you take a look at just one famine, the Bengal famine during the Second World War, at least 4 to 6 million Bengalis died during that, and that was entirely avoidable. It was a deliberate step taken by Winston Churchill to starve these people. So none of these things are mentioned in our history textbooks. What about the origin of India's civilization? Do your textbooks ever ask the question of who are the Indian people? What is their origin? What is the origin of India's culture and civilization? How old is India's culture and civilization? Here's the fact. According to archaeological evidence, India's civilization is at least 9,000 years old. And according to genetic evidence, according to the age of the lineage that is most common in Indian males, the R1A1A lineage, according to that evidence, Indian civilization is at least 15 to 18,000 years old. Now, India's textbooks will not tell you any of these things either, right? And what about the economic history of India? It's well known that before the Islamic invasions began, India's economy accounted for at least a third of the entire world's GDP. And the decline in India's GDP started during the Islamic invasions, and India's GDP crashed dramatically after the British occupation of India. So when the British began their occupation, India's GDP was still approximately a third of the entire world's GDP. But when the British left India, India's GDP was, I would say, about 2% of the world's GDP. So imagine where all that money went. And you would see a corresponding rise in Britain's share of the world's GDP. So none of these things are ever mentioned in India's history textbooks. What about India's contributions to science and mathematics? It is well known that Indian mathematicians discovered calculus at least 300 years before Newton and Leibniz. And India's contributions to mathematics are immense, but you will not see this mentioned anywhere. So there are so many problems, right? There are so many omissions and distortions in our history textbooks, and that's why I strongly recommend that we should revise them. We should rewrite them. And what is the effect that all of this has on India? Well, what you have is that you have millions and millions of impressionable young Indians who get brainwashed by the propaganda and the narratives in India's textbooks. It alienates them from their own culture, their own civilization, their own religion. It evokes a sense of self-loathing, of being ashamed of who you are and of your own culture and religion and your civilization. It creates a feeling of immense inferiority compared to anybody else, compared to all other cultures. Indians are told that their culture is misogynistic, it is casteist, and so on and so forth. And these narratives and lies are internalized by Indian children at a very early age. And it's very difficult to deprogram your mind of something that you've been indoctrinated with in your childhood. So what the Indian education system does is that it catches Indians young and indoctrinates them with lies. It implants false beliefs into the nation's psyche and consciousness, and it makes Indians worship false heroes. And there's so much more that it does. It causes immense harm to India as a nation, as a society, and as a civilization. And that is why I strongly recommend that the government should take up this project of rewriting India's history textbooks. Nilay Trivedi asks, when will the next research result in archaeology and genetics come that will destroy the Aryan invasion theory? So the next big research that will, like you say, destroy the Aryan invasion theory is going to come from the science of genetics. See, this theory was first proposed in the 19th century on the basis of biblical arguments. It was then reinforced on the basis of supposedly perceived differences in skin color and race between the people of North India and South India. And after the discovery of the Harappan metropolises of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, it was postulated that this represented a pre-Aryan, that is, Dravidian civilization. Now, all of these hypotheses have been demolished with evidence. So there is no evidence that proves that there was an invasion by Aryans or even a migration by Aryans. There is absolutely nothing in the archaeological record that proves or supports any such hypothesis. So once that happened, once the archaeological evidence went against this theory, the proponents of this theory fell back upon linguistic evidence. So they claimed that linguistics supports the Aryan invasion theory. And then scholars such as Shrikant Talagiri and Konrad Elst and others, when they debunked all of these claims, then the proponents of this theory had no option but to fall back upon the science, the newly emerging science of genetics in the early 20th century. And so they now claim that the theory is correct based on genetic evidence, and they proclaim that genetic evidence should now be the only criterion that decides whether this theory is correct or not, which is laughable and absurd because genetics has no correlation with language and culture and religion. Right, if an Indian person learns how to speak Japanese, their genes and their DNA will not convert to being Japanese. It will stay Indian, it will remain Indian. If an Indian person converts to Christianity, their DNA will not become Christian, right? It will still remain Indian. So there is no correlation between either religion or culture or language with genetics. And yet these people make this claim, this argument that the Aryan invasion theory is correct based upon genetic evidence. And the bulk of this genetic evidence is based upon the supposed origin of one particular patrilineal genetic lineage, which is denoted as R1A1A or R-M17. So this is a genetic lineage. This is the most successful genetic lineage in the history of humankind. Its members today number in the hundreds of millions or possibly even a billion. And this lineage originated in one single male at some point in time, several thousand years ago. And these proponents of this theory, they claim that the origin of this particular patrilineal lineage was somewhere in either West Asia or in Eastern Europe. So that's what they claim. And that's why they say that, and what we have is that a significant proportion of India's male population carries this lineage. A very high proportion of India's male population carries this lineage, and this genetic bloodline is found in high castes as well as low castes, in northern Indians as well as southern Indians. It's found everywhere. So on the basis of the supposed origin of this lineage somewhere in Western Asia or in Eastern Europe, these people claim that the Aryan invasion of India did happen. Now, a team of Indian scientists is currently in the process of publishing the results of a very large study of Indian genetics. I believe it has several thousand samples. So it gives you a statistically relevant data set. And on the basis of this data, they will be able to show whether R1A1A originates in India or not. Now, I have been arguing for a very long time that the origin of R1A1A is within this Indian subcontinent. And let's see if this paper supports what I've been saying or not. So this study is being done by Indian scientists. The lead scientist is Dr. Neeraj Rai, a friend of mine, great guy. So this result is expected to be published soon. It could be next week, it could be sometime in the next 6 months. Once you submit a paper for publication, it's no longer in your hands. It goes through a review process. They may ask for revisions, whatever. So we don't know how long it will take, but we can expect it sometime in the forthcoming months. So I believe that this is the result that will end this Aryan invasion myth once and for all. So let's wait and watch. Bharat asks, which are the best books to know about Indian history and where to purchase them from? So before I recommend any book, first a disclaimer and a statutory warning. The perfect book for studying Indian history doesn't exist. I wish it did. I wish I could recommend just one book from which you could learn about the whole of Indian history, but such a book does not exist, unfortunately. And the warning is that many books, even the good ones, suffer from some of the biases that I spoke about earlier. The colonial narratives sneak in some places. The references to the Aryan invasion theory as a self-evident gospel truth is found almost in all history textbooks that deal with India. And some of these books do whitewash the colonial genocides that took place in India. So this is my warning to you. Be aware of these facts. Some of these books may do it unwittingly, but it may still be present. So be aware of these facts and use your intelligence to reject some of the information where you perceive that it may have some of these biases and deficiencies. Right, so let's begin. The first book I would recommend is A.L. Basham's The Wonder That Was India. So A.L. Basham was, I believe, a British or Irish historian, one of these two, and he wrote this book in the 1950s. So it's an old book. It does speak about the Aryan invasion theory as a fact, but it is still a very good book to learn from. The second book I recommend is A History of Ancient and Early Medieval India by Dr. Upinder Singh. So this book, like the previous one, deals with the history of India until around 1200 AD. So the history of India from the very beginning of Indian civilization until around approximately the time when the Islamic invasions were in full force. So it deals with India's original history, culture, and civilization. And it's a very good book. It does make references to the Aryan invasion theory, but it's still a very good book to learn from. It has a lot of detail. It has a lot of pictures and illustrations. And overall, I think it's a fair and balanced book. But like always, my disclaimer stands. Be careful when you read it. Do not believe everything. I haven't read the whole book. I have gone through it. I've skimmed through it. I've read a few chapters, but I haven't read the whole thing. But overall, it looks great to me. So this would be my second recommendation for learning about the history of India. If you want to learn about ancient India, the early Harappan India, then I would recommend this book, which is The Rigvedic People by Professor B.B. Lal. So Professor B.B. Lal is India's greatest living archaeologist. He is probably one of the world's greatest archaeologists. He had a career that spanned more than 50 years, and this is one of the best books he has written. This book, what it does is that it demonstrates the cultural continuity of India's civilization right from the beginning of the Harappan era until the present day. So cultural continuity over thousands of years. That's what this book demonstrates. It's got maps, figures, and it's great. So I highly recommend this book. The next book, if you're looking for information about the Harappan era and information that disproves the Aryan invasion theory, then I would recommend you read The Lost River by Michel Danino. So this book is about the river Saraswati. So according to the people who believe in the Aryan invasion theory, which is most of the academic world, according to them, the Saraswati River is a myth. And this book debunks that claim. It debunks that myth with an enormous amount of data, historical data, geological data, maps, and so much more. So this is a fantastic book. It completely puts that myth to rest. I highly recommend this book. The next book I would recommend for anyone who is interested in disproving the Aryan invasion theory is Genetics and the Aryan Debate by Shrikant Talageri. So this is a book that was written in response to a propaganda book by Tony Joseph, and it's written by Shrikant Talageri, who is a fantastic scholar. He is the man who single-handedly destroyed all the linguistic evidence that the proponents of the Aryan invasion theory were using to claim that their theory was valid. So Shrikant Talageri is a fantastic scholar. This book goes into the genetics-based claims of the proponents of the myth, and it does a very good job at exposing all their falsehoods. So this is a great book, but it's not an easy book to read. It's a scholarly academic book, but it's a great book nonetheless. The next book I would recommend is Still No Trace of an Aryan Invasion by Konrad Elst. So Konrad Elst is a scholar. He's an entologist, and he has been working on disproving or debunking the Aryan invasion myth for a very long time. And this book is essentially a collection of essays that he has written over the years, over more than a decade or so, maybe longer. I have gone through about a third of the book so far. It is a fantastic resource. So I recommend this to anybody who has an interest in learning more about the Aryan invasion debate. The next book I recommend is On Ancient Central Asian Tracks by Oral Stein. So this book is about India's cultural presence in historic Central Asia during the Gandharan times and around that time, before the Mongol and Turkic invasions of the Central Asian steppes. So Oral Stein was a Hungarian-born British explorer and adventurer, and he did a fantastic job of exploring the remotest reaches of Central Asia, and he found so much evidence of Central Asia's ancient culture, Central Asia's pre-Islamic, pre-Turkic, pre-Mongol culture, which was entirely Indian. It was Buddhist, and it had elements of Hinduism as well. He found evidence of this in Tibet, in the so-called Xinjiang province of China, and in other places as well. So this is a fantastic resource. It's a very rare book. This is a newer reprint. My father has an older version of this book, a very beautifully illustrated version of this book. But if you are able to find this book in print, I highly recommend that you grab it because it's a wonderful resource. Right. The next book I recommend is The Theft of India by Roy Moxham. And this is a nice little book about the European conquests of India, the various European powers that invaded and conquered parts of India, the competition they had among each other for supremacy in India, and the political and military stories therein, and eventually how the British were able to prevail over everybody else. So it's a good book. You should read it. The next book I would recommend is The Goa Inquisition by A.K. Priolkar. So this is a very meticulously researched book in which you will find a lot of data, a lot of information that chronicles the barbaric atrocities the Portuguese perpetrated on the people of Goa with the help of Thomas Xavier in order to convert the people to Christianity, in order to re-engineer the social sphere of Goa. So this book chronicles that period of Goa's history in great detail. It's a fantastic book for anybody who's interested in knowing how India got colonized and how Goa assumed the cultural shape and form that it has today. So this is a great book for that. The next book I recommend is The South African Gandhi by Ashwin Desai and Ghulam Wahed. Now these two people are South African nationals, and what they have done is they have compiled a selection of Gandhi's own writings in South Africa. So this is a fantastically eye-opening book about how Mohandas Gandhi became the great leader that he eventually was. And this is about his formative years in South Africa, and it offers very interesting insights into how his mind worked and where his allegiances lay. Let me read out a quote from this book, which is printed right over here. It's a quote by M.K. Gandhi from 1920, and he says, "No Indian has cooperated with the British government more than I have for an unbroken period of 29 years of public life. I put my life in peril 4 times for the cause of the empire." Interesting, isn't it? So this is a really eye-opening book about Mohandas Gandhi. I highly recommend that you read it. Right, the next book I recommend is The Arthashastra by Vishnugupta Chanakya, also known as Kautilya. So this is a book about ancient Indian statecraft. It tells you about how Indians thought about strategy, about economics, about foreign policy, and about governance, about taxation, and so many other things. It's not an easy book to read. It's a voluminous and comprehensive book. But in case you are interested in learning about India's past and how India was governed, then this book is fantastic for that. I highly recommend it. And I have one more recommendation left, and that is The Principal Upanishads by Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan. So this is a genuine classic. It's an all-time classic. It's an enormous book. Its introduction itself is over 100 pages long. It's fantastic for anybody who wants to understand philosophy that goes beyond what the Western world considers to be philosophy. This is far deeper, far more profound, and it's great to read if you want to understand what Indian philosophy is all about. So with that, I conclude my book recommendations. I hope it was useful to you. Somitri Debroy asks, why has India stopped producing Nobel Laureates in the pure sciences? Great question. So for those who are not aware, the pure sciences are the natural sciences. In other words, physics, chemistry, and the life sciences. Right, so I wonder how many Nobel laureates has India produced in the pure sciences. I can think of C.V. Raman and no one else. And if we consider the Indian diaspora, then I can think of Hargobind Khurana for the life sciences, Subramanian Chandrasekhar for physics, and Venki Ramakrishna for chemistry. And I believe that's all. So India doesn't really have a tradition of producing a lot of Nobel laureates in the pure sciences. And I would not put it down entirely to a systemic issue or such, because we know that the Nobel Prizes are politicized. So let me reframe this question to ask, why does India not produce world-class research in the pure sciences? And to answer this question, one would have to ask another question, which is, how does any country produce world-class research in the pure sciences? Or what are the conditions that are necessary for any country to produce world-class research in the pure sciences? So the first condition is that the country should produce talented individuals, talented people. So that's the first condition. If a country doesn't have the talent, then it's never going to produce world-class research. The second condition is that the country should have a world-class education system. The third condition would be that the students should get sufficient exposure to science and scientists, because you need role models, you need inspiration. And the fourth condition, I would say, would be the country should have the right environment and facilities that are necessary to nurture a world-class scientific ecosystem. So yes, 4 conditions in total is what I would give. Now the question is, does India satisfy these conditions? Does India produce talented people? Oh my goodness, absolutely yes. India has the world's most talented people. Unfortunately, they are NASA and Microsoft and Apple and Tesla and everywhere else in the world. The best talent leaves India, and there has to be a reason for that. So yes, India does produce world-class, highly talented people. India produces an abundance of them. Does India have a world-class education system? Absolutely not. Do Indian students get sufficient exposure to science and to scientists? I don't think so. They don't. And lastly, does India provide its scientists with the right environment and the right facilities that would enable them to do research, to do high quality research? The answer again is no. So let's examine this in a little more detail. Let's do a thought experiment, a Gedanken experiment. We all know Srinivas Ramanujan. He was one of the greatest mathematicians ever. So let's take Ramanujan as an example and think about whether somebody like him, if he or she were to be born today, how would he or she fare in India's education system? Somebody like Ramanujan, whether he or she is a prodigy in mathematics or in physics or in any science, demonstrates awe-inspiring talent in one area, in one field, and is usually terrible or almost zero in everything else. So for example, Ramanujan used to get perfect scores in mathematics exams, but he used to fail all his other exams. He struggled miserably with English and other subjects. So what if somebody like Ramanujan was born today? If you put that person through school, how would he or she fare? So you would find that if that person is good in, let's say, mathematics, that person would do very well in math exams, but that person would struggle in other subjects. That person, if he or she were to be born in Tamil Nadu, would have to study Tamil, Hindi, English, history, geography, civics, and I guess something else as well. And for someone like Ramanujan, this would be torture. That person would have zero aptitude in all of these other subjects. And therefore, the education system would become an impediment, a giant barrier for such a student who actually is a genius. So the Indian education system at the school level excels at promoting mediocrity, at promoting average students, and at destroying genius level students. That is the problem with the Indian education system. A good education system would identify special talent and fast track that. And that is a significant deficiency that we have in India. And I'm sure many other education systems also have this deficiency. Now, let's say that by some miracle, this Ramanujan level person is able to go through the school level and perhaps the bachelor level and arrives in university. Now, what is the level of the education that is imparted at the college level and at the university level? In other words, at the bachelor level and the master's level. Well, all you are expected to do at these levels is memorize answers and regurgitate them in your examinations. Your exam papers always follow the same pattern. All you have to do is procure the exam papers of the last 10 years or so and work through them, and that's it. You're good to go. You can pass your exam. But it does not really nurture your abilities. It does not propel you to the next level intellectually. It does not give you any new knowledge or a higher level of knowledge. It does not do that. All you do is you study more complicated books. But once again, it's all about memorization. It's not about actually learning the subject, actually understanding the subject. It's not about that. So that's what somebody like Ramanujan would face at the college level and the university level. And what if that person were to reach the PhD level? Well, how is the Indian PhD system? It's terrible. On the one hand, you have these universities that churn out PhD after PhD, and if you look at their PhD thesis, it's abysmal. It's really very basic. It's not at a doctoral level. It's not really original research. the quality of the average Indian PhD is very poor, unfortunately. That's the sad truth. And on the other hand, you also have these horror stories where talented students who produce high quality original research are prevented from obtaining their degrees for whatever reason. For political reasons, maybe they don't get along well with their PhD guide, or whether because they have some other issue with some other faculty member or the head of department, or because of some political reason or whatever. But you have these horror stories that come out from time to time consistently with regards to Indian PhDs. So the PhD system is terrible. It does not emphasize on original research, and in the rare occasion when somebody does do original research, they are often victimized and marginalized. So the Indian PhD system is terrible, and unfortunately. Now, what if someone like Ramanujan were to actually even get a PhD and become a faculty member in an Indian university? What would they face there? Well, what they would face is a politicized academia. They would find that they are at the lowest level of seniority when they become a professor, for example, or a reader, or whatever level you begin at. And they would find that even though their mathematical or scientific ability is superior to everybody else in their department, they still remain at the lowest level, and promotions are given on the basis of seniority, how much time you have served, not on the basis of competence or ability or talent. And that is a ghastly feature of India's academic system, that promotions are based on mediocrity, not mediocrity, but seniority. Promotions are based on seniority and not ability, not merit. So that's what somebody like Ramanujan would face. Now, what about the facilities you get? Do you get the right environment in which to do research? Do you have freedom over what research to do, what path to take, what directions to follow? Usually, if you're a junior member of the department, you don't. You're told what to do by the seniors, by the head of department or whoever else. And if you're into experimental sciences, then do you get the right facilities? Does India have observatories? Does India have high quality world-class laboratories? Do Indian universities have world-class scientific equipment? The answer is no. I will not name the IIT, but there are certain IITs where you will find $1 million conference rooms, $1 million restrooms, but 2-decade-old scientific equipment in the laboratories. So that's the kind of situation you have in India's premier research institutions. And these are the reasons why India doesn't do well in the pure sciences or in any science. What you need is freedom from bureaucratic control and interference. What you find in the typical university department is that the head clerk has more power than the head of department. Bureaucrats hold all the power. They control the budget. They control everything else. They control logistics. The head of department is essentially subservient to the head bureaucrat. And that's what you find everywhere in India, in every single university. So this is something that needs to be rectified. Freedom from bureaucratic interference and control, the right kind of environment for research is needed. What scientists are forced to do is they are forced to spend their time navigating political and bureaucratic hurdles. And again, promotions involve politics. There's a lot of departmental politics. And the system is such that those that are adept at politicking are the ones that get promotions faster. So the criterion for promotions is not your talent, your ability. It's your seniority and how good you're at politics. And this is the sad truth. So what needs to be done is that The entire education system needs to be revamped from the ground up. It's terrible. It cannot be changed. It needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. And it needs to happen soon if India is to make any significant progress in the physical sciences. The cause for optimism is that India has probably the world's most naturally talented people in the world. They have this natural talent for science. So India needs to leverage that in order to propel itself forward if India wants to be counted among the major powers in the world. So that is the reason why India does not produce world-class research in the pure sciences and even in the applied sciences. Chaitanya asks, which is the best book or video series to understand quantum theory and dark matter from? And which is your best sci-fi novel? So I'm not sure at what level do you want to understand quantum theory and dark matter. Do you want to understand these topics at a superficial level, or do you want to go deeper into them and actually learn them? In other words, do you want to understand these topics with equations or without equations? That's the question. So how about I give you both the answers? I'll recommend books that will help you understand these topics without resorting to mathematical equations. And I will also give you books that will help you learn the topics rigorously. So let me first recommend 3 popular physics books about quantum mechanics and astrophysics, which will also cover dark matter. So the first book I would recommend is Quantum by Manjit Kumar. So what this book does is that it takes a historical approach to the development of quantum mechanics, and it tells you the stories of the scientists, the physicists who were involved in developing the theory. People such as Bohr and Einstein and Schrödinger, Heisenberg, and others. So it tells you about their struggles, their interactions, the way they cooperated with each other, the rivalries they had, and it also tells you about the field of quantum mechanics. So I believe it's a good book. That's what I hear about it. So I will recommend this book to you. The second book is Through Two Doors at Once by Anil Ananthaswamy. So this book is essentially about the double slit experiment, which essentially captures the enigma of our quantum reality. This is what the cover says. And it covers the double slit experiment and its implications and the various different ways in which this experiment is conducted, and it also talks about the various interpretations of quantum mechanics. So this is also a very good book to learn what quantum mechanics is about from. It goes into, I believe, a little more detail than the book by Manjit Kumar, and this is also a very highly rated book, so I will recommend this. The third book that I will recommend is about astrophysics, so it will also cover the other topic that you specified, which is dark matter, and that book is Astrophysics for People in a Hurry by Neil deGrasse Tyson. So Neil deGrasse Tyson is a very famous science communicator and astrophysicist, and this little book is very highly rated. It does go through the entire field of astrophysics, but it does talk about dark matter and dark energy as well. So I am sure you would gain a lot of value from it. So this is the third popular science book that I would recommend for these topics. Now, if you want to actually study quantum mechanics in mathematical rigor, then there's an entirely different and much longer path that you must follow. And you must start by learning basic physics, learning things like mechanics and electromagnetism and what's known as modern physics, etc. So the best book for starting off on such a project is this ginormous volume, which is Fundamentals of Physics by Halliday, Resnick, and Walker. This is an extremely ancient edition. Newer ones are available. This is a very good book it's at the 12th standard and beginning college level. So you need to first master this book, understand all the concepts, and then you can proceed further. And the next topic that you have to learn is mechanics. You have to master classical mechanics. And the first book that I would recommend you study is this one. It is An Introduction to Mechanics by Klepner and Kolenkov. So this is at a slightly more advanced level than the previous book. It takes you through the whole field of classical mechanics. It does a very good job of it. So it will build a good foundation for you. Another book at a more or less equivalent level is this one, Introduction to Classical Mechanics by David Morin. This is also a very good book which you can study to master the basics of classical mechanics. Once you are done with this book, then you can move on to slightly more advanced classical mechanics, which you can do by studying this book. Now, this is not a book that you actually study. This is a book that's full of problems. It's a problem book. It is Theory and Problems of Theoretical Mechanics by Murray Spiegel. It's a Shom series workbook. It's full of solved and unsolved problems at a slightly higher level. So you need to work through this entire book. It will give you a huge amount of confidence. Once you're done with this book, then you're ready for the next one, which is this little book by Landau and Lifshitz, Mechanics. It's a wonderful book. It takes you much deeper into the concepts of classical mechanics. So this is a book that I highly recommend. It's beautiful. The next book that you need to go through is this one, Electromagnetism by David Griffiths. It's a classic. You need to learn electromagnetism, obviously. So this book does a very good job of it. It's a good introductory textbook, and it's what most people learn their electromagnetism from. So I recommend this book. And you also need to study thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. So this book by Huang is a fairly good book for that, I guess. Or you could pick up any other book on statistical mechanics. This one is a good introductory book. So once you're done with statistical mechanics, you need to not think about jumping into quantum mechanics, but you need to first brush up your mathematics. And you do that by working through either this book, which is Mathematical Methods in the Physical Sciences by Mary Bose, or you could work through this giant book, which is Mathematical Methods for Physics and Engineering by Riley, Hobson, and Benz. You could use either of the two books. They are both equally good. So once you're done with this book, you need to move on to something like differential equations. And the best book for that, in my opinion, is this one, Ordinary Differential Equations by Tenenbaum and Pollard. A wonderful book, great book. I love it. Once you're done with this book, you can move on to this one, Introduction to Linear Algebra by Gilbert Strang. Linear algebra is something that is indispensable if you want to study quantum physics. And this is as good a book as any for studying the subject. After this book, you move on to this book, which is Mathematics of Classical and Quantum Physics by Byron and Fuller. So this book is essentially the highest level of math that you need in order to be good at quantum physics. Now, I've been recommending a whole bunch of mathematics books, and you asked me a question about quantum mechanics. The thing is, quantum mechanics is a highly mathematical subject, and it is essential to know the right math in order to be able to do anything in quantum physics. So that's why you have to do it. There's no way out. If you are going to be deficient in math, then you will not be able to progress beyond a certain level in quantum mechanics. So that's why I recommend all these books. You need to master your math. Right, now that you've done this, you're comfortable with this, now you're ready to jump into learning quantum mechanics. If you master this book and all the others that came before it, then quantum mechanics will be incredibly easy for you. I mean, in case you have the aptitude for it. So, after this, the first book for quantum mechanics is either this one, which is Quantum Physics by Iceberg and Resnick, which is at a very elementary level, or you could start off straight away with this one, the classic Introduction to Quantum Mechanics by David J. Griffiths. This is the book that most people start off with. So this is the book that you need to master first. Once you are comfortable with this book, you need to progress to a slightly higher level, which is this book, Quantum Mechanics by Zettili. So this is a slightly more advanced book. It has lots of problems, lots of solved problems and lots of unsolved problems. If you manage to work through every single problem in this book, it's going to give you a huge amount of confidence. You'll feel like you're on top of the world and you can conquer any quantum mechanical summit. So once you're done with this book, you move on to this book, which is Principles of Quantum Mechanics by Ramamurthy Shankar. This is a graduate level textbook, a great book. You need to work through this book at least once. And once you're done with this book, you can move on to, if you wish, this classic, which is Quantum Mechanics Non-Relativistic Theory by Landau and Lifshitz. And another book that I would recommend is a book that I like very much. I'm not sure if it is still in print, but it's a great resource, which is this one here, Practical Quantum Mechanics by Siegfried Flügge. Fantastic book, amazing book. It's a great resource, lots and lots of wonderful problems in quantum mechanics. It's a great resource if you want to learn how to solve various kinds of novel problems in quantum mechanics. So this is a great book for that. Once you are done, once you have reached this level, you need to move on to field quantization, quantum field theory. So I do not recommend the book by Greiner. It's a terrible book. The book I would recommend is this one, A First Book of Quantum Field Theory by Lahiri and Pal. So this is a good way to dip your toes into quantum field theory. It's a very good introductory textbook. And once you're done with this, you can move on to other books. But at this stage, I think you have mastered quantum mechanics, at least at the intermediate level. So that answers your question about quantum mechanics. Now, what about dark matter? Now, dark matter is something that lies within the realm of astrophysics. So to study astrophysics, you need to first understand gravitation. And to learn gravitation, you have to learn general relativity. Now, the first book that I recommend for studying general relativity is this one, which is Gravity by Hartle. Now, this is a very elementary book. It has, I believe, very few equations, but it works for people. So you can start off with this one. And then what you need to do is you need to learn tensor calculus, which is pretty much the only math that you need to learn to master this field. So for tensor calculus, I recommend this book here, which is Tensor Calculus 300 Fully Solved Problems. It is a Schwalm series book. You need to work through this book from cover to cover and you're set. Once you're done with this, you can move on to this book, which is Gravitation and Cosmology by Steve Weinberg. It's a good book for general relativity as well as cosmology. Once you have covered all of these books that I have just recommended, astrophysics will feel like a piece of cake to you. It's going to feel that easy. So that in brief is my recommendations. So if you are disciplined and dedicated, and if you're willing to set aside at least 4 hours a day to studying all of these books, then I believe that you can come up to speed within a period of about approximately 5 years or so. So that's how much time it takes to come up to an intermediate level, a lower intermediate level in quantum mechanics. And it's much easier to understand things such as gravitation, general relativity, and astrophysics along the way. And that brings us to the conclusion of today's episode. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And I'd like to apologize to those of you whose questions I could not answer today. I will try and answer as many of them as I can in the next episode. In the meanwhile, don't forget to keep asking me your questions. Use the hashtag AskAbhijit on Twitter, on Instagram or Facebook. And you can also ask your question here down below in the comments. So thank you once again for watching, and I will see you very soon.